Good afternoon. Can you hear me at the back okay? Is that all right? Good. Excellent. So I'd like to hear. The history of the London Group is the history of British modern art. So said Chris Stevens, lead curator, Modern British Art, Tate. It's a huge subject. Can I squash it into an hour? Hold on to your seats. It's a roller coaster ride. It was Charles Ginner who recalled that a large meeting eventually took place at 19 Fitzroy Street. Here, unless my memory has played truant, I have a vision of Jacob Epstein during a discussion on the running of this new society, leaning against the mantelpiece and saying to the assembled company amidst general approbation, "Let us call it the London Group." The date was the 15th of November 1913, but this was the second meeting of the new group. The first had been on the 25th of October, and the minutes record there resolved that the Camden Town Group and Fitzroy Street Group be amalgamated. Now, before we look at the formation of the London Group, we need to consider the events that lead up to this moment. The previous decade had generated a considerable amount of avant-garde art politics and related activities, and this culminated in a perfect storm from which the London Group would emerge. And it all begins with this man, Walter Richard Sickert. Born in 1860 in Munich, son of a Danish artist. When his first career choice as an actor failed, though he was always a showman, he went to plan B, which was to become an artist like his dad. He enrolled at the Slade. He met Whistler, who said, "Don't waste your time and money at the Slade, come and be my apprentice." Whistler took him to Paris, where he met all the Impressionists, including Edgar Degas. And it was Degas who he remained friendly with the rest of his life until Degas died in 1917, and Degas became his true master, whereby Degas' technique he used, where Degas would draw plein air faithfully, take the drawing back to the studio, grid it up, transfer it to canvas, and make a painting. That's what Sickert took from him. Sickert was one of only two true English Impressionists, the other being Philip Wilson Steer. Those two with others staged the London Impressionist exhibition in 1889. It was a commercial and financial flop. Sickert was slighted in public by Whistler. His first marriage had fell apart, so he retreated from London, went across the channel to Dieppe, and settled down there to paint the town's architecture for 7 years, going occasionally to his beloved Venice. In 1904, a propitious meeting occurred between Sickert and the young Spencer Gore, who was a student at the Slade School of Art, who was on a painting holiday in northern France with Albert Rutherston. They had instant rapport, and Gore would have told Sickert about all his talented young colleagues and friends at the Slade who were interested in French avant-garde techniques and developments, and they needed support, they needed a leader. This attracted Sickert, obviously, who was known at that time as the enfant terrible of British art. Accordingly, he moved to England the following year, 1905, and settled in Camden Town. Now, Camden Town, in the Regency times, had been quite a fashionable area. But with the coming of the three great railway termini, Paddington, King's Cross and Euston, it had become a teeming environment of sort of navvies and workers, with lots of bedsits and flats and apartments. And this would be perfect ground for Sickert's new subject matter that he'd just become interested in. And this was painting nudes or semi-clothed models in dingy bedrooms. It became known as Camden Town painting. Sickert described this as a gleam of light and life. And he thought he'd find this subject matter in Camden Town, so that's what he said. He also rented rooms in Fitzroy Street, and he invited young Gore and his friends from the Slade and others of like-minded persuasion to contribute to the rent of 50 quid a year and to bring easels to show paintings there, at homes, a salon on Saturday afternoons, where they would talk about progressive art and perhaps sell a painting or two. Some were described as little paintings for little patrons. So Spencer Gore, there's a sort of Camden Town, typical Camden Town painting by Spencer Gore. It is impastoed matrix of paint, shapes which are abstracted, and this typical high-keyed colour. Now, the Camden Towners, or many of them, would add white. With English compromise, they'd add white to the fauves, you know, strong colours straight out of the tube, like Matisse. So you get these pastel shades of purple, blue, greens and pink. Very, very typical. And Spencer Gore, an old Harrovian, was at the Slade with Harold Gilman, who he brought along, who just moved up from Kent. He was painting sort of Whistlerian type interiors before. Beautiful painter, probably the most talented of the Camden Town painters. This is a portrait of Sylvia Goss. Frank Rutter, who was the Sunday Times art correspondent, decided he wanted in 1908 to inaugurate a jury-free exhibition rather along the lines of the Salon des Refusés in Paris. And for a few bob, anybody could put 5 pictures in. And the response was huge. It was massive. It was overwhelming. So he had to hire a big venue. So he hired the Albert Hall, and he would ride round on a bicycle doing the hang. It was a great recruitment ground for the Fitzroy Street group of artists, because amongst a sea of mediocrity would be shining stars of young progressive artists, one of them being Robert Bevan. He was the son of a wealthy banking family. In fact, the firm in the 18th century was Barclays, Bevan, Tritton and Company, and at this time all the senior members of the Bevan family were directors of Barclays. Robert Bevan, not being academic, he inherited an artistic gene from his mother, was obviously going to go to the arts. So with the family had money, they sent him to Paris, the centre of the art world, where he trained at the Académie Julienne, and he also went to Pont-Aven, the sort of St Ives, if you like, in France, the artist colony, where he met Gauguin, he met Renoir, inspired by them, and he was painting almost fauve paintings the early part of the 20th century, probably leading the British avant-garde, unbeknownst to anybody. Being a country boy, his main subject was the horse, but he knew about his subject beautifully. So his work at this time is known about the cab yard scenes and horse sales and so on. And he would become the London Group's first treasurer. Also discovered there was Charles Jenner. Born in Cannes, south of France, he trained in Paris, initially in an architect's office where he had this very tight drawing. He brought the subject of the urban landscape to the Fitzroy Street group, and he trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and he discovered Van Gogh. He's one of the first artists to bring Van Gogh to England. Why he wasn't in the Van Gogh in Britain show and take, I do not know. But he was a major influence. So these artists were brought they found their spiritual home within the Fitzroy Street group. In 1910, Roger Fry, of the rival avant-garde movement, a Bloomsbury group, he was an entrepreneur. He staged his famous, or infamous, Manet and the Post-Impressionist exhibition in London. For the first time in London, large quantities of work by the Post-Impressionists, Van Gogh, Cézanne and Gauguin, as well as Matisse and others, were shown in London. It caused a storm. It was denigrated by the press, the critics, the artist establishment, the RA, who sort of hated it as not being proper art. But of course, for our Fitzroy Street artists, it's just accelerated and inspired them in the direction that they were going. Amongst the most hostile, though, was the New English Art Club. Now, this caused a problem because some of the Fitzroy Street artists had shown there. They were professional artists, they needed to sell their work, and when they were banned because of this show, for showing with them, they had a problem. They discussed whether to take over the jury or form their own professional exhibiting platform. And at a meeting at the Gattis restaurant on Regent Street, they decided upon the latter. It was called the Camden Town Group because Sickert, who invented the name, said he averred that the district had been so watered with his tears that something important must sooner or later spring from its soil. So the Camden Town Group had 3 exhibitions with Arthur Clifton at the Carfax Gallery. But there was one in 1911, 2 in 1912. Here is Sickert and Gore looking at notices, reviews of these shows. But they were all, again, financial disasters. And Arthur Clifton said, "That's it, you ain't having any more." So something had to give. In December 1913, Spencer Gore, as president of the Camden Town Group, had been invited by Henry Roberts, curator of Brighton Art Gallery, to stage an exhibition there entitled English Post-Impressionists and Cubists. It was, if you like, the last gasp of the Camden Town Group, but also a stage rehearsal for this new group, the London Group. It was in 2 rooms. The Post-Impressionists, the Camden Towners, figurative artists in one room, and the Vorticists curated by Wyndham Lewis, this irascible Welshman, who upset everybody and caused a stir. He was a member of the Camden Town Group. There were 16 members of the Camden Town Group, and women weren't allowed to join because at those times there were very, very few professional women artists who were of a progressive mind, and they didn't want to dilute it with amateur artists. And in a letter to Sickert's friend Nan Hudson, he said, "As you probably know, the Camden Town Group is a male club. Women are not eligible. There are lots of two-sex clubs and several one-sex clubs, and this is one of them." That was that. In the exhibition catalogue at Brighton, the secretary of the Camden Town Group, James Manson, who later became director of Tate in the 1930s, wrote that the London Group was being formed as a platform for all manner of artistic expression, provided it has quality of sincere personal conviction. It was too much for Sickert. Ironically, he'd been brought over to lead the charge of the new avant-garde, but he was overtaken by these cubists, these vorticists, who were interested in futurism of Marinetti and the Italians. And he couldn't stand it, and he resigned, something he'd do repeatedly, but he quite often rejoined. And he said again in the letter to Nan Hudson, "Like the bride at the church door, I have bolted." The other old stager with the Camden Town Group, Lucien Pissarro, eldest son of Camille Pissarro, in the early days of the Fitzroy Street, he was a huge influence on the young artists, direct link to Paris and to the Impressionists. He also couldn't stand it, and he said, "I do not see why we should have to put up with such rubbish," so he resigned as well. So the Camden Town Group had been talking to William Marchant at the Goupil Gallery because they could no longer go to the Carfax, and he was amenable. But he didn't like the name Camden Town Group because of the recent murders there had made the place notorious, and it was be bad for business, so that had to go. But also the Goupil was much larger than the Carfax, so they had to increase the size of this group, which sort of doubled in size, if you like. But he staged the first two or three exhibitions at the Goupil Gallery in March 1914, which was the first exhibition. This coincided, sadly, with the death of Spencer Gore. He just recently moved to Richmond, got married, he had a son who became an RA. Freddie Gore actually met him, amazingly, and he was out painting trees in Richmond Park. He just discovered Cézanne. It was raining, he got a cold, got pneumonia, and died. Tragic. He was called the perfect modern, but he was such a diplomatic guy. He could hold all these difficult political tensions together. But when he died, it all sort of fell apart. So that was a major element. So Harold Gilman was elected as the first president. So at this meeting, with Sickert in the chair on the 25th of October, there was a new constitution written. There were 16 rules, which I won't read out, and officers were elected. New members were added to the team. So before that, we have a work of David Bomberg. Work like this would have been in the Brighton show, which Sickert couldn't stomach. New members included Stanley Spencer, known as Cookham when he was at the stage, because he never moved out of town. The very talented Henri Gaudier-Bresca, sculptor who sadly lost his life in the trenches in 1915. Edward Wadsworth, who got involved with the First World War naval camouflage, dazzle camouflage. And women were allowed in, which is fantastic. So Jessie Etchells was a founder member. And also Robert Bevan's Polish wife, Sophie Kalauska. And the first exhibitions at the Marchant Gallery have been described as the London Group's finest hour. Perhaps we peaked a bit early. They were showing really gritty works about the war, including works by, famously, Christopher Nevinson. They show the inhumanity of war, the mechanism of war, and one of his works, this is the Mitrailleurs, which is in Tate, one of his works was actually censored by the government. He didn't take it down, he just stuck a bit of brown paper over the offending passage and it was allowed to hang. And also, Epstein's famous The Rock Drill, again associated with war, mechanics and machinery, which is rather sort of extraordinarily chilling, if you like. These war images were quite gritty. There were, however, war casualties, and new members were brought in to replace them. And the third exhibition was somewhat tamer. Mark Gertler wrote, he said, "I went to the private view of the London Group yesterday. What a rubbishy show. All the pictures, except my own, were composed of washed-out purples and greens, and they all matched so well that it seemed almost as if the artists all collaborated in order to breathe harmony at the show. In reality, it simply means that they all paint alike and equally badly." 1916 brought the peak of the horrors of the Somme, and there was sort of retrenchment of nationalism in the country, and suddenly everything foreign was frowned upon. The sort of watchword was no enemy aliens, no conscientious objectors or sympathisers. And that filtered down to the Goupil Gallery, to the owners there, and they would not allow such people to exhibit at the gallery anymore. That caused problems because there were pacifists within the London Group, and they would not agree with these terms, so they left. Luckily, Sir Ambrose Heel then offered his Mansard Gallery on Tottenham Court Road, where he'd been exhibiting East European applied art. And there, in fact, that's the first show at the Mansard Gallery, 1917, that one. And this is where Mark Goethe's famous The Merry-Go-Round was exhibited. The Evening News wrote of this work, "The man who painted a noise. But the picture is not a picture, it's a shriek, a groan, a hoot, a blare, a tempest of wild rending and more discordant noise." The London Group was the only society in London showing challenging work during World War I. It really was leading the charge. By 1918, the London Group, though, was in trouble. Making no money, artists had lost interest, especially the more radical. So now comes a period of transition as the vortices dropped away, and Roger Fry had been elected in 1917. And there was a gradual takeover by him and his Bloomsbury group. Harold Gilman, the president, had been away in Canada. Now, he didn't want to go, but he was short of cash, but he accepted a commission from the Canadian government to depict an awful tragedy of an ammunition ship blowing up in Nova Scotia, Halifax, Nova Scotia. And but Gilman, interestingly, decided to paint it from across the bay, so it looks rather peaceful. It's a massive canvas, it's huge. It's in the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. It's sort of slightly unfinished. But he was away. When he came back, sadly, going back to another pandemic, the Spanish flu epidemic had broken out. Charles Ginner got the flu. Gilman, his great friend, came to nurse him and contracted the flu and died. Ginner recovered and Gilman died. It's a great tragedy for British art because one of Britain's greatest painters had left. He had gone in his 40s. They'd fallen out, interestingly, these two artists, with Sickert earlier on, when they published their Neo-Realist manifesto, which went with a joint exhibition. Sickert reviewed this exhibition in the New Age magazine under the title, "The Thickest Painters in London." It was not supportive. Ginner was furious. In a letter to the New Age, under the banner, "The Worst Critic in London," he retorted, "I will paint as thick as I damn well please." So they sort of fell out. But the loss of Gilman was felt by the London Group, and there was no new president elected straight away, but Bevan, as elder statesman, sort of took control. But now the other Bloomsbury artists started to join. So we have Vanessa Bell and, of course, Duncan Grant. They sort of go together. And the shows started to change. And suddenly we get the first criticism of the London Group for not being radical enough. Ezra Pound wrote, "The pathetic thing is the assumption of modernity, the faint camouflage of the novel. Here we have the general école de goggle-woggle, cream ice and stucco tonality, the arty, the sloppy." So that's the modernist credentials of the London Group are being attacked. Now we're into the 1920s. In 1920, Fry, Grant and Bell did not exhibit, and the show was a critical and financial failure. Fry averted disaster and took back control. He became the power behind the throne. He was never actually president, but he tampered with the tradition, and certainly the diversity of the initial years was lost. Significant form and Cézanne now ruled. Fry wrote, he said, "I have always been elected to the jury and hanging committee, and since I had plenty of experience, it was generally I who arranged the pictures, and artists driven by jealousy and desire for power began to complain that the same people were elected to the jury. I felt they were against me. I proposed the jury should be drawn by lot. Everyone was delighted, and I did nothing about exhibitions. The result was that very incompetent people did the hanging, and in 2 years the group had no more funds. Then they asked me back. I reconstructed the constitution of the society, forming rules that would give a certain responsibility to a few elected artists. In fact, I reinstalled government and de-democratised the society. It's the only way to do something. When everybody shares responsibility, nothing gets done. So we had several more or less rowdy meetings where the old accusations were reiterated by the same people, but in the end, I think it will work. The incompetents he's referring to probably were Robert Bevan, Sylvia Goss, Christopher Nevinson, Randolph Schwab and Mary Godwin. Fry tried to turn the London Group in the 20s into sort of Anglo-French society and invited artists like Dufy and Utrilla to show. But the monotony of the 1920 shows attracted criticism. And in 1919, the 7 and 5 Society had been inaugurated, which was a return to order after the First World War. But by this time, later on, it had been taken over by Ben Nicholson, and Winifred Nicholson is sort of more progressive. And this attracted young radical artists away from the London Group, which was a bit damaging. Nicholson did actually show with the London Group in 1944. He was not impressed, and he described it as a dog's dinner. There were, however, lots of independent minds left with the London Group, including Matthew Smith, the great English faux with links to Paris. There was Paul and John Nash, that gave a lovely English sort of romantic flavour. There was Paula Vézelay, lived in France, bringing a sort of continental abstraction over to the London Group. And there was a large Jewish section of artists, including Mark Gertler, Bernard Meningsi, David Bomberg, Edward Wolff, and this artist Horace Brodsky. They had a unique flavour, and they certainly nicked in very well with the Bloomsbury artists. In 1928, Roger Fry and the President Rupert Lee organised a major retrospective at the new Burlington Galleries. There's the catalogue front. As the London Group had sort of drifted away and they wanted to be reminded about the revolutionary past, they gathered a lot of the work of the first two pioneering shows. This was a great success and attracted a huge increase in non-members. It's reasserting, if you like, the modernist credentials. The 1929 exhibition had 54 London Group members and 64 non-members, which included William Coldstream, who's in our show today, just dark, he just left the Slade in 1928, and his friend Victor Passmore, and between them and Claude Rogers in this show as well today. They formed the Euston Road School, which has huge influence with British art from 1937 onwards. And also Ivan Hitchens, later become well known in the neo-romantic movement, of his paintings of landscape in Sussex around the South Downs, and he had been described as the 20th century Constable. So they brought a new energy to the group. In 1930, the group was now boosted by sculpture. Frank Dobson, who had been president from 24 to 26, organised a special exhibition in 1930 on Selfridge's roof garden. It included Henry Moore, you know, one of our famous international artists, and Barbara Hepworth, and also John Skeeping, you know, major names that most of us, we've all heard of, hopefully. And they all became members. In 1933, Paul Nash had initiated Unit 1. This was a curious thing. Herbert Reed, the critic, certainly supported it. It was an attempt to promote contemporary progressive art through the twin spearheads of abstraction and surrealism. But because the two areas had diametrically opposed objective names, it was never going to work, really. And it had one show, but it did, again, pull away artists, radical artists from the London Group. And the large and rambling character of the exhibition in the 1930s were not popular amongst such artists they wanted to attract. Fry's reign was coming to an end, in decline. He died in 1934. And now we enter a new arena, which becomes more and more political and darker, because Hitler had arrived and taken over control of Germany in 1933, and the shadow of the right fell across Europe. Refugee artists started to appear in England after 1935, being tagged as degenerate artists by the Nazis, including Joseph Herman, who disappeared down to Istring Ginlay in Wales to paint the miners. He joined the group. And the Artists International Association, the AIA, was formed by left-wing artists, including Robert Medley, another group member, and Nash and Moore. But the London group still refused to adopt a political stance. The mantra was neither gospel nor creed. The founding principle of tolerance was still a guiding force. The 1936 London Group show, the 34th, was described as the intelligent man's Royal Academy, attracted the attention of one Professor Rudolf Hellway, who was the London's art ambassador of Nazi Germany. He professed a sympathy towards modernism, and he wanted to show a range of British modern art in Berlin in 1937. But of course the Nazis believed that modern art was the product of Jews and madmen, and when the German embassy offered to pay the transport of such works, they laid down conditions which of course the London Group rejected completely. But Hellman had better luck at the National Gallery, at the Royal Academy, with a naive John Lavery. The pre-war complacency about anti-Semitism was still widespread these times, but the moral awareness of the London Group did them a huge credit at this moment. At the 1937 AGM, David Bomberg proposed affiliating with the AI and the Surrealists against fascism, but this was rejected. A 1937 exhibition toured the north of England, and for the first time attracted a lot of attention. The Surrealists arrive. This is Eileen Agar, John Tunnard, and the weird and wonderful John Banting. This is just a year after the great International Surrealist Exhibition at the Burlington Galleries in London in 1936, when Surrealism was launched upon England. In fact, the term surreal wasn't even in the language. They called it superrealism, and it's now an everyday term. Very powerful movement, and straight away it's gone into the London Group. But from 1938, London Group members were showing at the Royal Academy, who was just starting to embrace modernism, despite Alfred Munnings, who notoriously hated modern art, being the president of the Royal Academy. The fiery days of 1914 were long gone. With the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, this took a great hit on all sorts of cultural organisations. Very difficult time. In fact, many would not survive, including the London Group's young cousin, the East London Group, which Coldstream and Sickert had been involved in. But the London Group was made of sterner stuff, and records show that during the war years they were quite active, including touring shows to Brighton. Walter Sickert died in 1942. He was aged 82. In the next exhibition, some of his work was shown in tribute, and the catalogue note states the late W.R. Sickert's works, which are included in this exhibition, is in affectionate memory of a great artist and father of the group. This work here shows that in the 1920s he sort of changed his persona. He signed his works Richard Sickert now rather than Walter. He lightened his palette and used a whole range of new subject matter, like weird 19th century illustrators like John Leach, and newspaper photos like this image of Edward VIII. It has been described as sort of proto-pop art. From 1943 to 5, the London Group showed at the Royal Academy. There were 73 members, including 19 women with 6 honorary. The prices of the works were between 10 and 50 quid. The Royal Academy had also invited the New English Art Club, the ROI, and other societies to show there during the war. The Royal Academicians were described as slick craftsmen, the London Group members as adventurous and chaotic, and the NEAC as having integrity, which was shorthand for reactionary realism. There's a note in the 1946, just post-war, in the archives, saying that the London Group showed in Sydney, Australia, at the Davy Jones Gallery, but that's all we know of it. Also, there's a proposed exhibition the same year at the Whitechapel Gallery. It did not happen because of bomb damage and repairs. Subscriptions doubled from 2 quid to 4 quid. This probably anticipated this note in the archives. As follows: H. du Plessis agreed to see Henry Moore in regard to his proposed resignation, which it is felt is only due to non-payment of subscriptions. John Dodgson suggested that we propose that Henry Moore be made an honorary life member of the group. This was not agreed. In 1949, a resurgence of interest in the London Group. 14 new members were elected, including Kenneth Martin, senior member to become the constructivist group, Edward Burrough. The wonderful John Trevelyan, sometimes surrealist as Burrough was, a fantastic artist with collage, and is also a tree painter. He's painting an array of trees here. William Scott, who famously used his kitchen for his subjects. Adrian Heath, a friend, a colleague of Passmore's, another well-known London constructivist. L.S. Lowry, one of Britain's most popular artists, who famously took the industrial north as his subject, and of course, as many of us know, his subject is about loneliness. And also the wonderful John Minton. This is Rotherhithe from Wapping. He's just discovered Picasso. He taught illustration at Camberwell School of Art. He sadly took his own life. He was depressive and alcoholic, and he feared the advance of abstraction, tragedy. And the neo-romantic Graham Sutherland. This is red landscape. It's Pembrokeshire. It's 1942. It's blood red. You've got the anxiety and horrors of war right in your face there. And his colleague, of course, John Piper, who famously painted the heritage buildings, the built heritage of the country, and during the war he commissioned a war artist to paint bombed out buildings. The King had commissioned him to paint a series of works of Windsor Castle, and he put his trademark dark, ominous, stormy clouds and sky to give it drama. And the King, when he saw him, he said, "Whoa, you had bad luck with the weather there." In 1950, John Dodgson is elected president. He was the first owner of Passmore's lovely portrait of Thelma Hulbert, which is in our catalogue. It's in private ownership now, so he must have been a great friend. He's an interesting artist. He comes from a wealthy family. He doesn't need to sell work to live. He has a famous uncle, Campbell Dodgson, who's a British Museum curator. His studio burnt down in 1951 in Kent, so a lot of his work was lost. He was a Slade student of art, loved Sickert, so there's always a grid under his work. He was the sort of godfather to the Euston Road School artists, Coldstream, Passmore, and Rogers. He gave them money and easels to set up the school. And he described the three of them. He went to go and teach with them at Camberwell School of Art after the war. He described the three of them in a rather interesting way. He said Coldstream was the teacher, Rogers was the painter, but Passmore was the artist, which I think is quite illuminating. 1951 brings us to the Festival of Britain. This is 100 years on from the great exhibition of 1851, the brainchild of Prince Albert, when the whole world's culture was brought to London. Clement Attlee described it as a tonic for the nation, and it was, if you like, to get back on track after the austerity of war, to look for the future with new culture. The visual arts programme was called 60 Painters for 51. There were 5 prize winners, of which 3 were London Group members, including Lucian Freud here, early work, we all know about him, and William Gere. And his abstract work, entitled Autumn Landscape, caused a furore and even questions in the House, apparently. And lastly, this wonderful masterpiece of Claude Rogers. It's in Southampton City Art Gallery. It's a large painting. At this time, these artists were given large bits of canvas, which bamboozled them because they were used to, during the war, when artist supplies were very scarce, they were just used to small scraps of canvas. So this was quite a culture shock for them. Rogers started by painting a nude, as Euston Roaders mostly did, but he said he changed his mind suddenly and thought, oh, I'm a realist, I'll paint a clothed. And his first model was unreliable, so he sacked her, and he hired this out-of-work actress called Miss Lynn. That's the title of the painting here. But before he'd finished, he got a job in a pantomime and ran off. So the legs are somebody else's, and the painting went to the exhibition still wet, but he won £100 prize, which took him to Italy, where he always wanted to go. And it's one of his skirting board paintings, and the little measuring marks you can see, little red marks you can see with the proportional measurement. In 1951, 2 London Group exhibitions included 728 works, but they still made a loss of over 30 quid. This was exacerbated by the exuberant party, which cost 10 guineas. In 1952, Claude Rogers was elected president, and this heralds what's known in the group as the golden era of stability and growth for the group. He was approached by Sir Gerald Kelly, president of the Royal Academy, who offered 2 galleries permanently for the London group in the summer to boost their modern section. This was thought about but rejected. The London Group did not want to be emancipated, and they wanted to stay independent. Lord Sainsbury offered financial support with administration. The 1954 exhibition toured to Southsea and Southampton, included for the first time the kitchen sink painters. The well-known Marmite painting, as he's called, John Bratby. This is Jean in still life, his long-suffering wife there in the background looking ominously at us. And of course, Jack Smith. At Southampton, Rogers quotes in the catalogue, each movement which has impressed itself on English art during the last 40 years has found a welcome home, and often in its earliest manifestation, with the London Group, which I think is significant. From 1956 to 65, the London Group showed the Royal Society of British Artists Gallery in Pall Mall. There was an £800 hire charge. It was quite expensive, but these were successful exhibitions. The 1960s heralds the start, if you like, of the new commercial galleries, such as Casmin, Robert Fraser, Gimple Feast, Waddington's and Greenwood. And this saturated the desire for the young radical artists to exhibit. And Maurice Kestelman, quoted later on in the 90s, he said, the London Group's power changed for a number of reasons. Chief among them was the spread of dealer galleries. After the war, a lot of galleries grew up all over London, and people who were, so to speak, avant-garde could get a show. So the attraction of the London Group as a place where, if you were a rebel, you could show your work gradually died out, probably in the mid-50s. That's the London Group show in 54. That's the catalogue cover for Southampton. The art dealer Robert Fraser said, suddenly around 1964, it was all happening. An eruption, you know, a social revolution. Pop art, Beatlemania, swinging 60s. So that generation of artists now join and show with the London Group, such as Bridget Riley, earliest manifestation of op art, David Hockney, Frank Bowling. And here, interesting enough, we now join the contemporary era. Sir Frank, as he now is still a member. That's over 50 years ago. It's quite extraordinary to think about, a longevity of the London Group and some of its members. And Frank Auerbach. So Auerbach, Bowling and Hockney all became members, and Sir Frank is still with us. In 1960, a wind of change came along. Rogers and his committee put forward a detailed 7-page document which had 24 recommendations, including obligations of membership, recruitment of new members, selection for exhibitions, exhibition policy, and public relations. This probably came out of this quote from Rogers. He said, recent exhibitions have aroused little interest, sales have been bad, the number of visitors absurd, as indeed have been the length and number of notices in the papers. Something had to give. This was quite difficult for many older London Group members. David Sylvester, the critic, also at this time, interestingly wrote, the trends which are decidedly more conspicuous in the London Group than in Bond Street are constructivism, Bombergism and Coldstreamism. There were lots of departures. Heron, Hitchens, Frost, Passmore, Robert Scott and Jack Smith, all upset by these proposals, decided to go. But in 1964, we now come to the 50th anniversary Jubilee exhibition at the Tate. There's the catalogue cover. July and August 54. It was the most important exhibition since World War II. By 1964, 208 artists had been elected members through the years, but only 107 were able to be represented in this exhibition, 150 works, including Epstein's torso and Paul Nash's famous We Are Making a New World, probably the most famous World War I image made, and Bomberg's In the Hold, and also Goethe's Merry-Go-Round. But many prestigious artists had to be left out, and I've had the same issue with this talk today. Who do you leave out? In 1965, Andrew Forge is elected president. 10 new members were elected, but others left, fearing more radical change. The fees were expensive. The Royal Institute galleries in Piccadilly now were costing £11,000. Things deteriorated. Sainsbury's stopped their admin support. The Arts Council, though, continued to cover losses. There was no exhibition in 1966 or 69. The London Group had little money. This was a real low point in the London Group history. Amendments to the Constitution ominously included dissolution. The Royal Academy were now approached again due to these low funds and were able to lease the diploma galleries. The RA were very keen to renew their association. And the Camden Arts Centre was also approached. But a Mr Carey there would have none of it. He said he didn't want anything to do with the London Group as he thought it was atrocious. When asked why, he said it was because of its members. Andrew Ford struggled to keep the London Group alive, and without his generosity and determination, it might well have folded at this time. In 1971, Dorothy Mead was elected president, the first woman president. A difficult time for any president to come along and try and pick up the reins. There was no exhibition in 1972, and by 1973, membership had declined to 59. They were offered a free show at the Whitechapel, but they still lost over 300 quid on it. However, in 1974, a major show at the Hayward Gallery, comes out of the festival, built at the time of the Festival of Britain. Their exhibition British Painting 74 included a very impressive 34 London Group members. The group continued to struggle to recruit good new members due to the proliferation not just of the commercial galleries but other institutions such as the Hayward, the Serpentine, Whitechapel and John Moores. And also it's very difficult to find affordable venues to show. And by 1975, a third of the members were in arrears and there was only 156 quid in the bank. Members were not resigning, they were just not paying. However, things were to pick up in 75. A big show at the Camden Arts Centre included the future president of the Royal Academy. Extraordinary when you think back to 1914. The young Christopher Lebrun, a sort of out of time romantic. One of his major motifs was the horse. This work with the horse, and he now paints pretty much abstract work. But also included was Philippa Beale and Gillian Ingham. And Jill is here with us today. Goes back to that time, and she's one of the most important, experienced officers within the group, and is now our chair of the exhibition subcommittee. So that's when she first started. Incredible to think. The London Group, with these new members, started to gather momentum. The London Group archive moved to Tate, and the Camden Art Show included a range of interesting media, including twine, synthetic enamel, formica, wax resin, shellac, quilt, and cement fondue. The 1979 Arts Council touring show, British Art Show 1, included 23 London Group members, including the three great Antonys of the London Group, which were Anthony Iton, Anthony Wishaw and Anthony Green, now all Royal Academicians, really great artists. Stan Smith was elected president in 1979. Claude Rogers had died this year, and membership rose to over 100 under his enthusiastic leadership. The 1980s sees the emergence of postmodernism, described by Eleanor Hartley as modernism's unruly child. 1981 saw renewed vigour with 2 exhibitions and 22 new members, who were not apparently elected according to the rules. It's been said that Stan Smith was cavalier with the rule book, but others have said that this is a bit of a myth and exaggerated. However, there was an extraordinary incident recorded in 1985 when Crefeld was elected president at an AGM at the Royal College of Art. But no minutes survive of this. At an extraordinary general meeting soon after, Crefeld resigned because rules had not been followed, and Stan Smith resumed his presidency. In 2009, member Victoria Bartlett recalled an encounter between Stan Smith and Dennis Crefeld at her house, apparently in regard to the disrupted outcome of a presidential election, in which the two had descended into fisticuffs. Smith, unknown to Crefeld, had once been a welterweight boxing champion and accordingly got much the better of the bout, which included knocking over the piano. That's the London Group. By 1987, only 57 members had paid up, with 19 in arrears. 1998 saw the 75th anniversary of the London Group, and a show at the Royal College of Art, Henry Moore Galleries, celebrated that. Finances were disastrous. They were now in debt. The subs were raised to 30 quid. The London Group had to get solvent or wind up. In 1989, Tracy Emin first shows with the London Group. The YBAs had arrived. Of course, they were curating their own shows in warehouses. They were business savvy, and they did not need groups such as the London Group. Saatchi snapped up the best artists. There was no common style or approach. They hated to be labelled. They worked across all sorts of media. In 1991, the Royal College of Art increased its hire fee from 3,000 to 15,000. But in 1993, Raymond and Edna Coxon donated £10,000 to the London Group. That was a boon. They had been at the Royal College of Art with Moore and Hepworth. The group was now showing at the Morley Gallery. 34 members were asked to invite a guest. Roger de Grey turned up with a work entitled "The Artist Surprised at Finding Himself in the London Group." 1993 saw, thick and fast they come, the 80th anniversary show at Saatchi's. Someone recorded that. We employed a caterer who ran a restaurant on a barge at Little Venice. She served roast duck, I think, which was as hard as rock. There was another 80th anniversary exhibition at the Concourse Gallery at the Barbican, opened by Lord Gowrie, no less, the Minister for the Arts. The first colour illustrated catalogue appeared, sponsored by Unilever. This was a costly and ambitious exhibition. Andrew Lambeth quoted, commenting on why artists liked the London Group. He said, "They showed work of excellence, it was run by artists for artists, and it supported young emerging artists. They valued the fellowship of the group and its unique reputation." In 1994, new voting procedures was always been tinkered with by the London Group, produced only 4 elect out of 20 put forward. There was now an exhibition at the London Institute Galleries, which heralded growing links with English art education in the London Group. And in 1995, Philippa Beale was elected president. Her conceptual art practice at this time included photography and text, and she was high up in the management of Central St Martin's, making this link with art education stronger. She immediately introduced a more professional approach, including fundraising, sales coordination, and reliable invigilation. She introduced a new biennial exhibition at the Barbican with 5 prizes. Her big selection committee included Matt's Gallery, Angela Flowers, Camden Arts Centre, Louisa Buck, the critic, and William Ling, fine art. She said in the catalogue, "Many current members are influential teachers. These former young radicals are no longer spring chickens, and in these times when youth is seen as a virtue, the London Group has perhaps quite understandably found it hard to embrace current practice with its instant stars and high-priced tickets." In 1996, Philippa had lots of new plans and put forward lots of applications for grants, but 9 out of 10 were turned down. There was an application to the National Lottery Fund, for instance, for a millennium history of the London Group. Also at this time, there's the initiative of a new idea, which was support for small selected shows, which became known as small group exhibitions, now known as SGEs. Everybody likes an acronym, and this would cause a few problems in the future, but more of that in the future. In 1997, at the Extraordinary General Meeting, there was a review of possible charitable status for the group, which would have given wonderful financial benefits to the group. In 1998, there's first mention of a website. The subs went up from 30 quid to 50 quid. And in this year, the group staged an exhibition called Transient. Now, the group has long worked with all sorts of interesting themes and ideas about exhibitions, and this is a particularly interesting one. The idea behind this was to try and confound the critics in the marketplace. It was ethereal, it was performance-based, time and space limited. And in that terms, it was successful. In 1999, the thorny issue of charitable status again raised its head, and the London Group had actually spent about £3,000 on it. So, they put a lot of time and money into it. But it was knocked on the head by a letter from the Charity Commission. And it said, "I regret that I am unable to invite registration of this organisation. It is clear that the trustees, the working group, intend to continue exhibiting their own work. The very exhibition of their own work would in itself render a significant private benefit to those trustees whose own work is exhibited, which would outweigh any public benefit so as to preclude the organisation from being established for exclusively charitable purposes." So that was the end of that. At the end of the 1990s, the YBA's era was slightly over. Someone described it as the hothouse had cooled down. In the Millennium Year, the British Art Show included member Paul Arago. Of course, she's got this fantastic exhibition now at the Royal Academy, which is very political. I haven't seen it myself. In 2001, Peter Klossik was elected president. And in the same year, Edna Coxon had died. And she bequeathed to the group an extraordinary sum of £116,907 to the London Group. This enabled extraordinary ambitious plans for the 90th anniversary of the group and beyond. In 2003, a regular newsletter was introduced, and the London Group was up to 82 members. The 90th anniversary show was staged at the Gallery, Cork Street, and an expensive book known as the Blue Book was published, which included 72 members showing works and texts. And Philippa Beale wrote a very interesting article, well worth a read, entitled "The London Group Inside Out." There were 3 exhibitions in 2003 which cost over 15,000. The Blue Book cost 33,000. The website cost 6,000, and they spent 12 grand on admin support. So the bequest was very much used. They needed new members though to infuse fresh blood, and the group went up to over 90 members in 2004. A new website and logo was launched. The issue now of small group exhibitions was raised by member Tony Carter here. He was questioning the idea of subgroups, sort of cliques if you like, because he thought the equality so important in the group of the membership was eroded. The issue was debated but not resolved at the 2006 AGM, but it was agreed that the process for selecting SGEs should be clear and transparent. Later on in 2010, another member, Alfred Harris, went even more extreme and tabled a motion on this very issue entitled Allegations of Corruption. It was defeated at the AGM. In 2006, there was an exhibition in Amsterdam for 8 members, the first international show for 60 years, entitled Artie de Salon, organised by Artie et Amicitiao. Excuse my pronunciation, a Dutch group similar to the London Group, founded as way back in 1839 with 350 members and around 500 friends. The British Council, though, rejected a grant application for support. In 2007, Susan Hare was elected president. Here's her work in her gallery and studio, The Cello Factory. More anon of that. And she exhibited in there the first exhibition for sculptors the same year. That year, Mike Liggins was appointed secretary. He became totally invaluable to the London Group for 10 years. He's been described as an administrative powerhouse. He was amazing. But just in time, because there was so much activity going on, somebody needed to get hold of it and administer it. But if the spending pattern continued in the same way, using up all that money, the London Group would be broke by the Centenary. The Cello Factory was used in 2010 for the first LG annual. We've held it there pretty much ever since. There was a new logo competition in 2010, which is the one you see today, and the torso, Repstein's torso there on the right, has just been added fairly recently. In 2012, the new Fundraising and Publicity Committee devised a project called Draw. The idea was to raise 10 grand. Members were to donate a drawing for a prize draw. Tickets cost 100 quid each, and at a big event at the Cello Factory, numbered beads were pulled out and the lucky winners could choose a drawing off the wall. It was very successful. Ironically, the Royal Academy had organised a very similar event with them, and it was called RA Now, a very popular type of idea. The London Group was now organising a packed programme for the centenary year. There was still 525 grand in the bank, and a new bequest turned up at 25 grand from John Cloudesley Thompson, was ring-fenced for catalogues, and that's what paid for the catalogue that we have today. It's paid for a catalogue every year, still going strong. David Redfern, here today with us, the London Group's archivist, had finished writing his History of the London Group book, which I think took 8 years. Yes, he's nodding. An extraordinary, an amazing achievement. And here it is. It's on sale here. All the members on the list at the back. It's an extraordinary publication, wonderful. And most of my research has come for that. So thank you, David. So 2013 brings us the centenary year, 100 years of existence, a wonderful achievement. There was an explosion of activity and publicity. There was an impromptu party at the Café Royal, where the London Group was first discussed, and a formal reception at the Tate Britain, hosted by the art historian Richard Cork. And here we have the London Group there outside Tate Britain. Some of you will recognise your younger selves looking nice and happy. The BBC website staged a virtual show called In Pictures, 100 Years of the London Group. And there was a big open exhibition at the Cello Factory. And in that, Susan are quoted as president, "The group has managed to stage shows through both world wars and hope to continue for the next 100 years. We are really strong at the moment. It is a very lively group, and really a lot hasn't changed since the beginning, when it was very argumentative and very eclectic. Also, it was apolitical then, and it's apolitical now, and we're not subject to fashion." There was an exhibition at Mottisfont Abbey, not far from where I live, near Romsey, which I went to, called The London Group at 100. There were 44 members exhibiting alongside historic works from past members from the Derrick Hell collection, which is held at Mottisfont. The visitor's book is interesting. You might imagine what your standard National Trust visitor might think of contemporary art. So here are some quotes. Pretentious, overworked, no wonder arts grants are reducing, and surely the National Trust doesn't need to show this to pretend to be up with modernity. But that was balanced with what an interesting exhibition, good for the NT, and wonderful exhibition, thrills the soul. What is interesting is that the exhibition generated nearly 20,000 visitors, probably the most successful in terms of visitor numbers the London Group ever seen. That just shows you the power and pull of the National Trust. The most popular show there has been over 75,000, I should show. National Gallery standard. Fantastic. In 2014, the Centenary exhibitions continued. There was an exhibition at the Ben Urey Gallery in London called Uproar, the first 50 years, which examined the controversial storm at the beginning of the group's existence. And at Southampton, where I was working, we staged From David Bomberg to Paul Arago, alongside a selection of past London Group members in the collection, of which there are over 100 members, very strong. Works were selected by, along with me, by David Redfern and Victoria Rance. And alongside that, there were 75 members, contemporary members, showing the salon-style gallery alongside. That was a great show. In 2018, there was a major exhibition organised by Suzanne Swale at St Ives in partnership with the Penwith Society. It was wonderful to be down there. And the group continues to show, to stage biennial exhibitions, which attracts increasing numbers of young and old, all sorts of artists to show with us. Activity remains very high. At the Centenary, Genetic Mood, the artistic partnership of Tim Pickup and Nicola Schaumann, digital artists, declared, they said, we see a mission for the London Group in the 21st century to do what it did 100 years ago and support artists working with the latest technologies against the grain of contemporary art practice. That's exactly what we are doing, what we should be doing to support and forge the new technologies and new art practices. So activity remains high with pop-up exhibitions in car parks, church crypts and yards. We've had a programme of salons where informal discussions on a whole range of art issues have been very useful and interesting for members. There have been more shows outside London, at Shoreham, at Deal, St Ives and now Honiton. There have been international forays to the Netherlands, to Italy and Wisconsin, the USA. All these events are the ideas of members, showcasing our skills and enthusiasm for contemporary art in all its forms. At present, the London Group boasts 102 members, and it continues to function without style or dogma. Nicholas Usherwood, the art critic, summed the London Group up saying, London Group was a vital strand of artistic diversity and free thinking in an art world increasingly dominated by market forces. We're now entering a new era with Amanda Looms, who's here with us today as our new president, taking over from Susan Hare, who was our longest serving president just a few weeks ago. The London Group is a wonderful family to belong to. Thank you.